Good afternoon, everybody. I think I'll begin by putting Anthropocene in its proper context and perspective, although a lot of you may already be aware of it. Anthropocene is a proposed era, an epoch, which dates from the time when man, human beings, Homo sapiens, started having a major impact on the planet. Their activities started practically reshaping the planet in many ways. We currently live in what geologists call the Holocene age, which began about 13,000 years ago. But more and more geoscientists are beginning to consider the proposal for renaming this period as the Anthropocene, because in the short period of 200,000 years which Homo sapiens has been on this planet, they have changed the planet in more drastic ways than in the hundreds of millions of years which preceded their arrival on this planet. So the impact on the planet has been so massive that there is now consideration among geoscientists to rename this particular epoch as the Anthropocene. The matter is being discussed at the appropriate international forums, and there is also there are three proposals from when the Anthropocene should start. From which year should we start calling it the Anthropocene epoch? The first is that it should start with the post-agricultural age. That's about 12,000 years ago. One school of thought is that it should start with 1945. That was the first detonation of the nuclear bomb, which introduced radioactive materials, man-made or man-caused radioactive materials into the atmosphere. And the third is that it should start from 1963, which is the date of the first non-proliferation treaty. So anyway, they're working on that. That is the background for this particular session. Now, like I mentioned earlier, what we've been doing now over the last few years, especially the last in the post-industrial revolution age, is we are literally reshaping the planet. We are cutting mountains, we are blocking rivers, diverting their flows, we are making rivers run dry, we are felling green cover and trees on a scale never seen before. The Amazon has already lost 30% of its total area. We in India are doing our best to stay in the same league. In the last 5 years, more than 16 million trees have been felled in India for various, within quotes, development projects. We are releasing man-made viruses into the ecosystem. We are well on our way to destroying the ecosystems which have existed for hundreds of millions of years. Every year, according to World Watch, every year 10,000 species are going extinct, which is 1,000 times the normal rate of extinction. So this merits some attention on the part of writers, artists, poets, novelists, because perhaps literature has not yet caught up with the massive acceleration in the pace of changes which are taking place on the planet, physical and otherwise. What we need today perhaps is another Huxley or another George Orwell or a T.S. Eliot or a W.H. Auden or a W.B. Yeats to write about these things in a creative manner, so that, artists have to engage, creative writers have to engage with the pressing problems of the world today, which perhaps is not happening to the extent it should be happening. I did a Google search to find out how many acknowledged writers are writing about climate change and its consequences. And don't forget, climate change is only one aspect. There are many dimensions which are linked to climate change. There is inequality. There is vulnerability of the poor, the ones who can least withstand climate change. There is capitalism and fascism. On the political side, they go hand in hand. Because a lot of the depredations which are taking place in nature today are driven by capitalistic impulses, the desire to make more money. There are social aspects to it, how human values are changing, something which we saw during the pandemic, which Sumit has recorded in his work, which perhaps he'll explain, how we drove millions out of the cities into their villages. We withdrew transportation from them. They were forced to walk. It shows a certain change, a certain brutalization of society. So, climatic events are not related only to nature. They are also related to how we as human beings are evolving. And unfortunately, perhaps it's not a good comment on the kind of evolution paths we are taking. So what I'll do, fortunately, writers have begun to write about this. There are not many. People like Amitav Ghosh, Klein, they have begun to write about this, and we are fortunate to have two of them amongst our midst today, Sumit and Helen are here. Sumit, of course, has done a vast... Sudeep, I'm so sorry. Since the morning I've been calling him Sumit. Sudeep, sorry.
I'm just polite. I just thought I'll wait and make it public. That it was sort of
once I become a serial offender. Yeah. So, he's of course written a lot, prose, poetry, drama, translations, etc. He'll speak about it. Helen has just published her first book. Is it a...
It's the first book, but I already published the second one. So this one is from 2019, okay. And
so Milk Teeth is the first one.
Yeah, that's
the first one.
Yeah.
Milk Teeth is the first one. She'll explain about it, but it's interesting. It's about a society which, in a post-climate event, isolates itself in a particular area, cuts off all communication to itself, subsists on food, etc., petrol, food, etc., batteries, which it has stored from the pre-climate event thing. And the book explores how suspicion, not only of outsiders, but even of themselves, becomes so rampant that people are eliminated, etc. So these are some aspects of Anthropocene, how the age is shaping, and whether we can dream of a utopia or a dystopia in the days to come. I'll now request Helen, would you go first?
Yes, so thank you for inviting me. It's been an honor to be here in India. It's my first time in India and my first time at the Jaipur festival, and it feels incredible, so thank you all. And also to be here with you on stage. Looking forward to this panel. So, you see I'm a little bit nervous, but anyway. Milk Teeth were published in 2019 and was translated into English, so that's also why I can be here. I wrote it in German first, so I didn't translate it, but I wanted to tell you there's a quote I started, it's on the first page, it's from Joan Didion, and it says, "Don't you think sometimes people are formed by the landscape they grow up in?" And I think that's where I started the book, thinking about this question. And the main character, Skalde, she lives in this territory with her mother, and it gets warmer and warmer. So she found home in the nature, but now the nature gets warmer and warmer and changes a lot. And I asked myself, how does it feel if everything changes around you? Do you stick to it? Do you hold on to it? Or do you have to leave? So yes, that's just a short summary, what I thought before I started writing. And I think I'm just gonna read now to you, because it's more interesting than talking about it, I find it. So I don't start at the beginning. So you have to buy the book if you want to know what's in the beginning. Because the beginning is about the childhood of Skalde. But now she's older, like 20 or something. And yeah, she likes a lot walking through forests. So that's what she does in this chapter. I walked through the forest. The pine stood in the last of the light. Time and time again, I paused, tilted my head back, and looked up at the branches that could cut up the sky with their rusty shapes. I oriented myself with the markings I had made an age ago. Crosses made in the bark with a knife. The resin made my fingers stick together. The scent stayed on my skin for days afterward. I reached a clearing, an almost circular zone. Up from the ground grew grasses bleached by the sun. I slowly went into the center, where I had built branches into a dent. It had been my first hiding place in the forest. Far enough away from Edith that I could talk myself into believing that she didn't exist. Just that you know, Edith is her mother, so she doesn't call her mother, so maybe that gives you a hint how their relationship is. Stooping over, I entered through the opening. I saw that the wooden crate that I'd hidden here had been moved. Beside it was a bed made of moss. It smelled differently too. Someone had been here. I opened the crate. Nothing was missing. I took out one of the cigarettes and lit it. When I turned around, standing in front of the entrance was a child. We looked at each other. It was wearing a t-shirt that went down to its knees. Its feet were in overlarge sneakers crusted with dirt. But the most remarkable thing was its hair, red as if ablaze. No one had hair that color in the territory. I stepped out of the den. The child backed away. "What are you doing here?" I asked, lowering the hand holding the burning cigarette. Without saying anything, the child walked past me, sat on the moss bed and wrapped its arms around its knees. I crouched down in front of the den. "You can't stay here," I said. The child turned its head and furtively swept its eyes. I stepped away from the entrance. It got up and came back outside. It looked around indecisively and fumbled with the hem of its t-shirt. I took a drag on my cigarette. The smoke was barely visible. With its shoulders hunched, the child went to the edge of the clearing. Once there, it turned around and nodded. Only after it had disappeared among the trees, I did understand that the nod wasn't meant for me. The child had bid farewell to the clearing, just like I did every time I left. "Come back," I said, raising my voice. Nothing stirred. I called out again. The pines crackled in the wind. I stepped anxiously from one foot to another. I was going to shoot out a third time when the child appeared again between the trees. It looked at me, waiting. I stepped out of the cigarette and stuck the butt in the pocket of my raincoat. "Do you want to come with me?" I asked. The child threw a look back into the forest. The darkness already stood behind the trees. Above us, the sky was losing its color. "I live in a house not far from here. It's safe there," I said. The child leaned against the pine it was standing next to. I held out my hand. To my surprise, it stepped out from the trees. "Promise?" it asked. I nodded. The child took my hand. "This way, it's not far from here," I said. While we were walking to the house, the child didn't let go of my hand once. If someone had stood in our way, I would have knocked them down without thinking twice. "You lost your mind," Edith said. She stood in the doorframe wearing her black rabbit fur coat, her greasy hair hung in front of her face. The circles under her eyes were dark violet, like bruises. She hadn't got up from the sofa in weeks. "Where did it came from?" she asked, eyeballing the child which I had set on the kitchen table. "I found it in the forest," I said. "How can that be?" I shrugged my shoulders. Edith stood next to me. "None of the others have hair like that," she said. "It can't be from here." "How did you make it to this territory?" she asked the child. As she didn't receive an answer, she turned back to me. "Can it speak?" I nodded. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "It has to eat something." "And then?" "What do you mean?" "When are you taking it back?" "Back where?" "Back to the forest." There was a silence. "I promised it that it can stay with us," I said. "You did what?" "I promised it." "You really have lost your mind." "Anyone else would have done the same thing," I said. Edith twisted her mouth into a sneer. "You don't really believe that, do you?" She turned to the child and asked its name. Once again, she didn't receive an answer. "And you're sure it can speak?" "Before, in the forest," I said. "Mices," said the child, pointing at itself. Edith shook her head. "Sounds made up." "I'm called Skalde," I said. I looked at Edith to prompt her. She cleared her throat and said her own name. "Skalde Edith," Mises repeated. We nodded. The light over our heads flickered. I looked at the window. The darkness had swallowed the garden. The kitchen was reflected in the window pane. Edith and I, shoulder to shoulder, the child shielded by our bodies. We were standing very straight, like we weren't afraid. So that's maybe like a first scene, and then I want to read another scene to you that maybe you know more about this territory, because now you don't know.
Helene, sorry to interrupt. Maybe if we have time, we'll come back to
Okay,
you.
okay. So
Sudeep can
of
do
course.
it. But the interesting thing about what Helen was reading and about a book is how quickly human values and family values can break down if we are deprived of the conveniences of modern living, which is a prospect which life after climate events can postulate for us. That's the important thing. Shubha.
Namaskar, Sat Sri Akal, Adab. Good afternoon, good evening. I'll be reading from the book which is eponymously titled with the session itself. It's called Anthropocene, and it's about climate change, contagion, and consolation. The reason I'm reading this out is just want to emphasize that this book was an accident. I live in Delhi, and what was surrounding me in Delhi and what was happening in India during the lockdown and the pandemic and the pollution in the city, which is a direct consequence of climate change, impelled me to write this. I was working on a very different book, which is called The Whispering Anklet, which is on classical Indian dance and music. But this, yes, so can you imagine the kind of external forces that impelled me to write? What I do want to emphasize is the first part of the book is about climate change and the devastation of the pandemic, but really the second half of the book is all about light. It's about hope. It's about positivity, because without that, there is no way we can wake up if we think negatively. This is a poem called Disembodied, and it's set in my home city of New Delhi. But when I travel around the world with this book, I was on a book tour in the UK recently and elsewhere, and I realized it could be London or Brasilia or New York, because the issues which I realize I'm writing about can be in any big city or any polluted space. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from aurora borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from the fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak. My lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. Our universe, where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worshipped not for its blessing, but its contour. Artificial shape shaped by Nautilus, skin moistened by L'Oreal and not by the season's first rains. Skeleton strength not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left, or too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. Disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no pole star navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away, just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there is too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass. Thank you. That's very kind. The first poem in this book is a very, very short poem, and it's called That Is, I.E. And it is written for my son. His name is Arya, A-R-I-A. And normally I don't share my poems so much with him because if I send a draft of my poem, it's a Baba, not another poem, right? But I did get a response from him many weeks later, of course, because he got around to my text message. Because it's a short poem, I had to text it to him. Unusual for me, because I'm still very analog and write with my hand. And he said, Baba, it was actually rather beautiful, but I have no idea what you're talking about. But for me, that was good enough because at least the aesthetic nerves in my son were tingled. The rest will follow. The other wonderful thing that happened, because we were living in the times of Zoom and everyone we talked to appeared as little mosaics on the computer screen, these tiles we are speaking to. We are wearing a smart shirt on the top, but I always wore my pajamas at the bottom because it was so much easier. That I found this lady, I wouldn't say a serial non-Sumit, who didn't say Sudeep. Maybe you're Ajay, not Avay. But I saw her on the screen many times over, and she wrote to me saying that, I love these poems, which is lovely, and she's a songwriter and a filmmaker, and she says, I want to make some songs out of these. And she's since then taken some of the poems, and we released an album, which is by this name, that is. But today you'll just hear the poem raw. If you go to my YouTube channel, you'll see the film there. That is because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf, you hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent, you hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. Thank you. You're a very, very generous audience. In the West, they are so silent and monastic, and they may clap at the end, but very, very politely. But इस देश में मज़ा आता है क्योंकि हम मुशायरा भी तो सुनते हैं ना, तो सब कविता के बाद मतलब एक जोश से जो कर रहे हैं आप कर रहे हैं. Please continue that though. This particular poem is called Language, and initially, I thought this poem was about the politics of language itself, the way language is twisted, the way spin doctors can influence election from a third country, Russia influencing, say, America's poll system, or the way language is mangled on social media. We have such beautiful words and letters, but now people use emojis, and that too, they are pixelated graphics, which are not even that pretty. So it's about the politics of language at one level, but actually it's a very personal poem because it's a poem about my first typewriter. It's a manual typewriter, it still sits on my desk, it still works, it's well oiled, but ironically, it is more difficult to source the silk red and black ribbon than to get the typewriter going. That's the irony of the age we are living in. Language, and it opens with an epigraph from Italo Calvino, and I quote, "Without translation, I would be limited to the borders of my own country. The translator is my most important ally." My typewriter is multilingual, its keys mysteriously calibrating my bipolar, forked tongue. Black-red silk ribbons, pools unwind as the carriage moves right to left. In cursive hand, I write from left to right. My tongue was born promiscuous, speaking in many languages. My heart spoke another, my head yet another, the translation seamless. Oracles, ventricles pump blood. Corpuscle-like alphabets, phrases, syntax cross-fertilize my text, breathing life. Texture-enriched music, cadence spatially enhanced. osmotic, polyglottal, a polygamy of grammar. Letter forms dance, ligatures pirouette, ascenders, descenders, pitch perfect. Imagination isn't caged in speech. Speech cannot be caged in language. Thank you. The reason I got a little distracted is I don't know how many people were there at the Amer Fort yesterday, and there was this incredibly stupendous dance performance, Odissi largely, and the Odissi version of Sri Lanka. So there were some Sri Lankan dancers dancing. We in Indian music, the tal and the bol, we count things, the steps and so on. There was a noise there which was a click of something. And my poems tend to be very, very cadenced, and it's properly calibrated with beat. So you can actually sing them out if you want to. And it was not according to the same meter as my poem, so I got distracted partly. The side B of my life is as a photographer, and there's a whole section of photography in this book. During the pandemic, of course, we were very, very lucky. I mean, some of us are very privileged. I have a terrace on my house, and at least I could escape to the terrace. And within about 2 months or so, I realized nature has the capacity to heal. The skies became bluer, the birds came back, and there was a whole community talking in semaphore code on our adjacent temples. If you remember, as children, we used to make these telephones with 2 matchboxes and a wire. So everybody was on the terrace, so we are shouting and throwing the newspapers to the adjacent house. It was just wonderful how social we became despite being elevated. So there's a whole chapter in the book, mapping. I selected one frame on my terrace, and I shot it 3 times a day over 3 months or 4 months. And from all those photographs, I've just selected 10 which are in the book. And it just showed you that how nature beautifully heals. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to color correct the photographs. We don't have to saturate it. We don't have to alter the tonality or the texture. We don't need a dark room. It happens for us. We just have to look out. And we human beings are the problem, which is why Anthropocene is coined. I'm going to read out the last quote which bookends the book. And it's from this wonderful Polish poet called Czesław Miłosz. The context is a little different because this was written after the wars, but you'll see how it applies now. And I quote, "My generation was lost, cities too, and nations. But all this a little later. Meanwhile, in the window, a swallow." हम भूल जाते हैं हमारे आसपास जो ब्यूटी है, देखते ही नहीं हैं. We go to counselors and shrinks and so on with our supposedly really big problems, But the birds come back and tweet, not the twittering tweet, but they tweet anyway. The leaves come back on the street, on the trees. The sun doesn't complain that I have to get up in the morning and, give us light. So next to that kind of cosmic pattern, why are we so frustrated? It's ironic. Anyway, so this is called Hope Light Leaks. And there's a photograph across the page. You won't see it. But what happened was at night I went to the bathroom and, you're half sleepy, so I didn't shut the door quite well, and I forgot to put the light off. And the light that was escaping from the top and the side, to me, maybe I was reading too much Frankenstein or some ghost stories, but it reminded me of an unfinished crucifix. And for poets, we are crazy, of course, and that got me writing this poem. But of course, the context of that time is the Black Lives Matter was happening, George Floyd happened very recently, and so there are hope, light leaks. And it has a epigraph from Martin Luther King Jr., and I quote, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that." Late at night, light leaks, spilling beyond the door's rectangle edge. A cleaving schism, its shape a partial crucifix, a new resurrection. Lights plane, waxes, wanes, viral loads expands, contracts. Photons spill, conduction sparks, light slow removes cataracts veil. In this blackness, lives matter. And I'll just end with the last poem in the book. It's called Om, like the Om Mani Padme Hum, Om, the first sound of the civilization, the first sound of the womb, Om, the first sound which made language, the start of language itself. It was written at a time when we were facing this horrific situation in Delhi, the second wave, where bodies were being burnt. I mean, we ran out of crematorium grounds, so bodies were being burnt in parking lots, on the sidewalks, and so on. It's a horrific thing that I've never seen in my life. I know the horrors of partition and the carnage through films, through stories people have told me. But I'm very privileged to grow up in independent India, and I've never seen until this time that this kind of, what that could have meant, and this was just a fractional thing. At one level, we were losing, we had no space for burying or burning the dead. But the middle of Delhi at that time was being dug up to make a Disneyland situation. That's the irony. There are some lines in this poem which are in italics, but I won't flag them. They are from this wonderful, wonderful Indian Kashmiri poet. Many of you might know his work, Agha Shahid Ali, a brilliant poet, but you'll recognize the lines. Om, a ceremony, and it has a small epigraph from Goethe, and I quote, architecture of frozen music. In my city, I'm surrounded by constant cries of the dying, burning pyres heaving under burden of wood, smoke, and bones, wailing summed up by the sonic notes of Om. Civilization's first sound, Sanskrit syllable, echoing a conch shell's harmonic mapping, its involute spiral geometry, holding within and emanating airborne sonar screams. My ancestors, grandmothers, mother, blew into the smooth shell, cupped in their palms, held intimately, as if it were a talisman, a prayer, a pranayam in yoga's daily ritual. But breathing is such a privilege these days. Pandemic struck, oxygen deprived, my friends perish, the country buckles airless. Even an exquisite cerement lacks the sheen or wax to rub the contours of a corpse now. Each day, as I write endless condolence notes, etching dirge-like couplets on gravestones, my city continues to be dug up, not to make space for burial sites, but for palaces of illusion, an architecture of frozen music, greed, calumny, a country without a government, a country without a post office, Shahid laments. Let me cry out in that void, say it as I can. I write on that void. Om, celebration now, an unceasing requiem. Yet we chant in hope for peace. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
Thanks, Sudeep. That was very moving. So now,
Could I ask a question, Sudeep? Because I find it so interesting that you have so much hope in the book. Because in Germany it's kind of different. I think I have a friend, she's also a writer, and she went on a strike because of climate crisis. So she stopped writing because she thought, I can't write anymore because the government isn't doing anything. How can I write? And I wanted to ask you how you write and how you find where do you find the hope? And can you tell me more about the hope? Because I think I need some more hope.
Well, we are all political people, aren't we? Essentially, we cannot escape politics, whether we are an artist or a poet or something. My poems are not political in a kind of strident sense. They're very, very subtle. It sort of slowly sleeps into your bone, and that's what I want to do, because I want to make people uncomfortable with truths so that the untruths get erased. Hope. That's why I read the last quote from Czesław Milosz, one of your neighboring countries, who Germany didn't treat very well, of course, in the wars. Without hope, we can't carry on. I mean, if we stop writing, then the governments in power, or the bureaucrats in power, or the technocrats in power have won. The only way to make a political statement and have human hope is to write and do something. Without art, we can't breathe. Without breath, we can't live. So we don't have a choice.
You know, as the artist, as somebody said, the role of the artist is not to look away. You have to address it squarely. And passion is, as Sudeep's poems convey very strongly, the passion has to be there. And the passion, the creative passion of the artist has to challenge the negative passion of Anthropocene. Because Anthropocene, the destruction of Anthropocene, is also driven by passion. But the passions here are greed, insatiable appetite, ego, the desire to dominate, the desire to become rich quickly. So these have to be countered in a creative form, which is the most effective form. Scholarship is all right, scientific papers are all right, but it is ultimately devolves on the artist to reach the hearts of the people. Now, we're running out of time. We just have about 4 minutes left. So I'll throw it open for questions and answers. Yes, please.
Hello, hi, I'm Shravanti and I'm a huge dystopian world fan. I've read The Maze Runner and other works. I just have a question for you, Helen. When you write a world filled with dystopia, do you think it's sort of a coping mechanism for what you've been dealing with your life or in the current world?
Yeah, kind of, I guess. I think for me often this book is also not, it's dystopian, but it's not really dystopian. So it's more like, it's our world, but I shifted it a little bit. It's like a different light so that you can see it better. So I think, yeah, that's why I don't really call it dystopian, maybe. Yeah.
I have a very particular question. So, as we can see, the climate situation that we are in now is very well rooted by the very sociological foundation of the humans. So, we address and solve the major ways through which these problems occur. But what about this rooted and minor branch of the problem that we see? That the climate change and the climate situation that we are in is actually caused by the very sociological foundation of the humans.
How do we solve it? It's a big problem to solve when we are trying to make it better. Think about climate in another way. We think about climate from a geopolitical, geographical point of view. It's external. But you do not ever think of the climate that's inside the human body. The physiology, the mental end of things, our thought processes, the dreams, the process of lung incapacitation because of bad climate. Now, if we try and address those individually ourselves, collectively we'll solve a lot of problems. And the greed aspect of it and so on is also driven from inside, from somewhere, from some dark space. So collectively, as people, as states, as nation, and then hopefully together we can solve it. But as we know, the main powers to be who set the world rules do not themselves address that.
I'll differ with you slightly on that, Sudeep.
Yeah.
We can't blame this all on the government. We ourselves, we need to live much simpler lives. If you continue to fly by plane instead of taking a train, a 1 passenger kilometer by plane emits 343 grams of CO2 into the atmosphere. The corresponding one by train is only 14 kilometers. But we will fly. We will eat food which is brought from thousands of kilometers away. Ultimately, we have to live simpler lives. If you go to a climate conference in Glasgow, and all the guys, the global leaders who are going to decide about the future of the world, fly in special chartered flights. 1,500 planes in Davos to ferry guys who are going to decide how to reduce carbon emissions. That kind of hypocrisy. We have to call out that kind of hypocrisy. There are no small or easy solutions.
Because it is very rooted, like basically what happens that throughout the human have evolved sociologically, they have socially they have evolved, they have made it society, they have made it differentiation on basis of this, and by these differentiation wars are caused, and ultimately through these wars we have these weapons and
it's also as you were saying, prioritizing thing. I mean, this is about 20 years ago, it was accidental how I got into the whole discussion of climate change. Not that I was not aware of it. I was watching the news, I was just flipping channels, I forget whether it was Al Jazeera or BBC or NDTV or CNN, but the president of Kiribati is a small island nation in the Pacific, which is built of 33 atolls. The reporter was asking him, and he was this wonderfully graceful person as he appeared on the screen, and the reporter was asking him about something very fancy, the educational policy in his country. He says, I will answer your question, but may I just tell you that we are just 6.5 feet above the Pacific Ocean. We are the first country to go underwater, and that was a long time ago. Will you, the rest of the world, take my entire peoples to another country, called climate refugees? So if we don't think about these things, what are we talking about? Anyway, there's so much to talk about. But thank you for being such a beautiful audience.
I've been told that our time is up, like the planet's is almost up. So thank you. It's a very receptive audience, and thank you for the panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.